Saskatchewan's highest court has ruled in favor of the federal carbon tax, rejecting Saskatchewan's argument that the plan was unconstitutional. That's a big blow to the province's campaign against the tax and could spell trouble for other provinces also challenging the plan in court. Saskatchewan had argued that it was unfair for Ottawa to impose a tax on some provinces and not others just because the feds didn't like their climate plans. They said the federal plan violated provincial jurisdiction as well. Today, in a split 3-2 decision, the court disagreed, saying the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act is not unconstitutional, either in whole or in part. Saskatchewan says it will appeal the decision to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the federal environment minister had this to say.
I'm hoping that Conservative politicians, from Scott Moe to Doug Ford, to Jason Kenney to Andrew Scheer, will stop fighting pricing pollution, one of the great tools that we have, and start fighting climate change with us.
We'll have more federal reaction coming up in the show. Plus, we'll break things down with a constitutional law expert. But first, let's turn to the province behind the court challenge. And Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe joins me now from his office in Regina. Hi, Premier Moe. Great to see you again. Thank you for your time.
It's great to see you, Vashi.
Premier, how much has this case cost taxpayers so far, and how much more will it cost them to take it to the Supreme Court?
Well, I'll speak on behalf of our case that we've put forward here in Saskatchewan. All of the work has been done by our constitutional law branch within the Ministry of Justice. So the incremental cost to Saskatchewan residents for this case is zero. It'll continue to be zero. Plus maybe a couple of flights to the Supreme Court when we get to that point. But the fact of the matter is if we do not move forward and are successful in holding off this ineffective tax that will cost so many families so very much in this province, the cost to families would be very, very large. So the incremental cost is zero at this point, and we feel the majority of the people in the province support us going further with this. So we will.
Can I ask you how do you know that it's ineffective?
I would ask where in the world has a carbon tax been introduced and being the reason for emissions reductions. We have seen areas of the world where there have been reductions in emissions where they may or may not have a carbon tax, but largely those reductions are often due to another policy initiative like the phase out of coal, for example, coal-fired power, a change in regulations around industry practice. I am not aware of any jurisdiction in the world where a carbon tax alone has in any way been an effective tool to reduce emissions. Our nervousness around it here in Saskatchewan and dare I say other provinces is it is an effective tool in actually moving some of those good paying careers that we have in our communities to other areas of the world. In our steel manufacturing industry, for example, in our energy industry, we have seen investment flee this nation due to a number of policies up to and including this carbon tax.
Premier, you asked where in the world it might have worked. I'm looking at two examples right now in Sweden, which I believe has one of the world's highest carbon taxes. That was implemented in 1991. By 2000, emissions were as much as 25% lower than they would have been without the carbon tax. In Denmark, the per capita emission of carbon was reduced by 25% between 1990 and 2005. Both those jurisdictions have carbon taxes. Again, how do you know that it will be ineffective?
Absolutely, and we should dig into each of those countries to look at the regulations, the legislation, and the other rules around some of the industries that are operating in each of those countries and how those have impacted the emissions reductions and whether it was due to those regulations that have been passed, rules, if you will, or has it been attributed actually to a carbon tax. Then the second piece I would put forward is to whether those countries are actually consumption-based countries or like Western Canada and the nation of Canada, export-based countries where we build, produce, mine things, and we ship it to other people all around the world. A carbon tax will ultimately make our economies less competitive, and ultimately those jobs will move to other areas of the world. So how we generate wealth around this world is very different.
The carbon tax has not made BC's economy any less competitive.
Again, a very different economy from that in Saskatchewan. When you look at agriculture in Saskatchewan, crop agriculture, very different than British Columbia, and I would say much more of a carbon sink than agriculture in British Columbia. British Columbia has natural gas, not the heavy energy products that we have. We mine potash here in Saskatchewan as well through our solution mines and conventional mines that do emit, but they're among the cleanest mines in the world. And we must remember that we are mining and producing some of the cleanest products in the world in Western Canada, and we should ensure that that is recognized.
But could that not be recognized within a carbon pricing scheme? I mean, there are other heavy emitters. Even the PBO pointed out that most of the revenue from the carbon tax will, in fact, not come from those industries.
It actually comes from families, exactly, which makes
and
it
then is rebated
what we
to
have
them,
always said, a wealth redistribution program, not an environmental initiative in any way, shape, or form, which speaks to the fact that we should actually have a conversation around how can we do better by the environment rather than taxing hardworking families and redistributing that money as a government, which I don't think anybody really agrees with that type of a program.
Well, I mean, it's redistribution to a certain degree, but it is the parliamentary budget officer again looked at it and confirmed what the federal government was saying, that over the next 5 years, all but the wealthiest 20% of Canadian households will get back more in the rebate than they actually pay in the carbon tax. So your argument about it being a tax grab, isn't that impacted?
No, not at all. And small businesses will receive nothing back. There's a number of those intermediate businesses that will be paying and will receive virtually nothing back. Further, the parliamentary budget officer went on to say that ultimately the initiatives that it won't have any substantial reduction in carbon emissions because a number of the initiatives are already underway that he had referenced.
That is not. The PBO did not say that it will not have an effect. He was studying the tax portion of it and the rebate portion of it.
He indicated there's three initiatives that would reduce actual emissions in more fuel-efficient vehicles. That's happening already in our transport trucks and the vehicles we drive. It would phasing out the coal-fired power electrical generation. That's happening already across the nation, and we have targets in Saskatchewan with respect to that. The third item is a result of a carbon tax, and that would be less supply of energy products directly targeted at Saskatchewan, Alberta, Western Canadian industries. Not less demand, less supply. So we would be choosing to reduce the income, the economic opportunity that we have in those industries arbitrarily. And I say those are some of the more sustainable heavy oil production industries in the world, and we should look at getting that product to market and displacing some of the dirtier product that is now being used by Canadians and others around the world. He
said, though, that it would also result in less consumption, and that was just based on his early estimate. So that's people using less gas, for example, because the price of gas has gone up.
Which is why I've also indicated that I believe this report is, to a large degree, premature, actually, in its estimates around the indirect costs, the loss of jobs, really, that will come about from this policy, this wealth redistribution program. I don't understand how the two go together. Which is why, consequently.
Can you explain what you mean by if people are using less gas, that means that there will be less jobs, fewer jobs?
No, it actually didn't. It didn't speak to less demand. It spoke to less supply. The National Energy Board actually speaks to demand going up about 50% between now and 2040. So there's really dueling reports out there with respect to what our energy industry will look like into the future. You have the National Energy Board saying a 50% increase. You have the Parliamentary Budget Officer saying there'll be a 15% or 15% reduction in supply. That ultimately means that we are making a choice and not to participate in an industry that we are among the most sustainable in the world. And to me, that is not what Canada is about. That is not going to help in any way the economic wealth that our families are generating in this province. And most certainly, when you take sustainable energy production, when you compare it to production around the world off the market, you're not doing right by global greenhouse gas emissions either. So this is not a win for Canada. It's not a win for Saskatchewan. It's certainly not a win for the global challenge of climate change.
You say that this ultimately will be decided in the federal election. If that's the case, why are you going to keep going to court?
We have a 30-day window to take this to the Supreme Court. We had a split decision here in Saskatchewan today with 2 judges forming a detailed dissenting opinion that says this federally imposed carbon tax is not constitutional. So we'll be taking it to the Supreme Court. But ultimately, I think you'll see Canadians go to the polls this fall with this as the ballot question, and we've seen that happen over the course of the past year a number of times in provincial elections. I don't see why that would be any different at the federal level this fall.
If they do, though, instead vote for the Liberals, does that mean that Canadians are in favor of the carbon tax? Will you accept that verdict if that is the outcome of the election?
We'll accept the verdict of the Supreme Court of Canada.
Well,
That's why it's there.
I'm asking, though, because you're saying on one hand, if the outcome of the election is against the Liberals, that means that nobody wants a carbon tax. But if it's in favor of the Liberals, you're not willing to accept that they're in favor of one.
We actually don't think it's an effective tool to reduce emissions and address what is a global challenge.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, but thank you very much, Premier Moe. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Vashi.
So how is Ottawa reacting to the decision and the threat of more legal battles to come? Sean Fraser is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment, and he joins me now in studio. Hi again, Mr. Fraser.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Nice to see you. It's your every other day, basically.
It seems that way.
Yeah,
That's all right.
I appreciate it. It's a big story that's going on right now, and I want to highlight something specific that was brought up in the court decision. So. It's a win, and it talks about it being constitutional, but it also talks about the sort of the utility of the carbon tax in fighting emissions. It actually addresses that issue beyond just the constitutionality of it. At the same time, we saw protesters today in front of the Prime Minister saying that the federal government has to do more to fight climate change. When or will the federal government announce if that price on carbon is going to go up?
First of all,
2022.
yeah, certainly. So I think first of all, just to address the decision before I directly address the question, this court decision affirms what we already knew. The federal government has the authority to regulate in the national interest greenhouse gas emissions and implement a minimum standard. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, and the political fight that we've seen play out is simply that. It's never been based on facts, it seems. With respect to the plan to put a price on pollution, the only plan that's in place right now is to have it accelerate from $10 to $50 by 2022. There's going to be a review in 2022 to see if the policy is working effectively. There's not a plan to change it beyond that, but we'll assess the facts on the ground based on science, facts, and evidence at that time.
How are you going to measure effectiveness? Is it going to be by, at that point, how much you've reduced carbon emissions?
Certainly. Well, the starting point for me is that we've got a goal outlined in the Paris Agreement that we're working towards right now.
That we're far short of right now.
You know what? I think though there is a gap right now, it doesn't factor in certain elements like increased ridership in the public transit investments that we're making, adoption of zero emissions vehicles that are seeing an uptick since the incentive is put in place, and policies that are not yet really taking hold.
So you're saying Environment Canada has not assessed any of those policies?
Not built into the, not been fully modeled into the gap that you're addressing. We do have a plan to get to the Paris Agreement target, and we're going to be implementing a number of different measures to get there. A price on pollution is going to be part of it, but when you asked whether we're going to assess it in 2022, we're going to be looking at the effectiveness in terms of the return on investment, so to speak. Is it having a positive impact in reducing our emissions? Is it getting us where we need to be to ensure that we're avoiding the worst consequences of climate change?
Do you think you need to signal to voters earlier than 2022? I mean, you're going to be, your government yourself says this should be a ballot box question, right? The idea of what is necessary to fight climate change. Should you signal to voters, this is actually how much it's going to cost you 10 years from now, not what it's only going to cost over the next few years?
Well, there's only a plan in place for the next few years right now, and we can't signal 10 years into the future what we haven't actually modeled out because we haven't conducted that.
But you're signaling that you're going to hit the targets 10 years out in the future?
Certainly, and one of the things, if you want to talk about the cost, one of the things that's essential, and if you look at the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report that was just made public within the last couple of weeks, he confirms what we've been saying all along, that the majority of households can expect to be actually better off. And the court recognized this too when it said the government's actually not keeping any of the revenue and it's returning all of it back, whether it's collected from residents or big emitters, returning all of the revenue back to residents inside the provinces, with 10% going to small businesses in the mush sector.
That's the plan right now.
Certainly,
but what happens post-2022? That's what I'm saying. Isn't it fair if you're saying that this is the way we're going to fight climate change? This is why our plan is superior. Isn't it fair to provide Canadians with a more fulsome picture of what to expect to attain those targets beyond 2022 when you're running on it in the federal election?
So just to your point about that being the plan now, that's the plan that's baked into the legislation. If another government wants
Correct,
to change
yeah.
that in the future, they'll actually have to have a legislative debate in the House of Commons to change that. So we're not moving from the plan to put a price on pollution because we believe it's effective. If we want to look at the whole host of other measures, my opinion is we should be doing as much as we can, as fast as we can. It's not just a price on pollution. I think one of the victims in this whole debate has been the fact that we know that it takes more than just a price on pollution to get where we need to be. That's why the Clean Canada report that we've issued outlines over 50 different measures that are actually working towards getting there. And we know we need to do more, and we're going to continue to push the envelope to get there.
The question I have, though, is even in concert with all those other things that the government is doing, the additional measures beyond just the carbon tax, if you're saying, and your government has guaranteed, and we've had Minister McKenna on the show many times, that the targets in 23 will be attained, that is not with a flat carbon tax after 2022. So if you're willing to say we're doing all this other stuff until then, why won't you be able to tell Canadians how high that carbon tax will have to go in order to achieve the targets that your government says we will achieve?
Well, as I mentioned, with over 50 different measures, each of those policies has to be monitored to fully understand the impact that they're going to have in terms of emissions reductions. Until we actually have a number of these policies being implemented, measured, and we understand the impact that they're going to have, it's hard to understand how much we need to adjust one of those 50 different policies. So what we know right now is that we're looking forward to 2022 to accelerate it to $50 a ton at that point in time, all the while returning the revenues to households to make sure that by and large they're left better off than they are as a result of the plan being put in place.
Is there a commitment from your government, no matter how high the price on pollution goes, the carbon tax, whatever you want to call it, that it will always be rebated?
That's actually
It will always be revenue neutral, no matter the price.
That is built into the legislation. So, in fact, as the price accelerates from $20 to $50 per ton, the rebate through the climate action incentive actually grows over time as well.
Even beyond 2022, I just want to be clear.
Yes, that's built into the legislation. I've got no plans, the government's got no plans they're hiding to start taking revenues. And in fact, the court was actually pretty quick to point out the difference between a regulatory charge and a tax, and that on this exact point, describing the fact that this isn't about raising revenue. The law as it's modeled and as it's been adopted by Parliament is designed to make sure that the revenue is returned to households.
It's interesting because the majority decision was very clear that it wasn't a tax. The minority decision, the dissenting opinion of the two judges, and it was a close decision, 3-2, the dissenting opinion viewed it as a tax. And that was kind of central to their understanding of why it was okay or why it wasn't.
That wasn't the only piece.
No, there's lots more.
And the much bigger issue, to be clear, is whether the federal government has the jurisdiction to deal with a national concern. And of course, pollution knows no boundaries. And to argue that the greenhouse gas emissions are not a national concern, in my mind, is ludicrous.
Can I ask you from a politics point of view?
Sure.
What we've heard from the premier so far is that the ultimate decision time on this will come in the federal election. Are you worried that a decision like this allows Andrew Scheer to say the only way to get rid of the carbon tax is to get rid of Justin Trudeau, to make that link so very direct?
I worry about what's within my control, and when I'm sitting in the House of Commons, I'm not always just factoring in how is this going to play, what are the Conservatives going to say about our plan. What we're trying to do, and I find people at home respond to sincere efforts to pass good policy. And if you actually look at the court, one of the things that I found fascinating by it, they went so far as to suggest that putting a price on emissions is not just part and parcel of a climate plan, but it's in fact an essential aspect of the global effort to reduce emissions. So if we're focused on adopting good policy that's going to improve our environment and put more money in the pockets of Canadian families, I trust that Canadians will make a decision that's in their own self-interest.
I get what you're saying, but the first words out of Minister McKenna's mouth today were all about Conservative premiers and if Jason Kenney and Doug Ford want to get together, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's a political statement on both sides right now.
Oh, and there's certainly politics wrapped up in all this, and I'll be the first person to say how frustrated I am when I see Conservative premiers across Canada putting money towards fighting climate action rather than climate change. The fact is we do operate in a political environment, but that doesn't mean that your primary motivation has to be to win the political fight. And I find that
they view it differently, though, right? Like they view it as their narrative is a very different one. I take yours, but they're saying that this is a tax that will unfairly hurt people in provinces in which they govern.
Yeah, that's certainly what they're saying, and I couldn't disagree more. It's an essential component of a plan to reduce emissions, and I think it's important that we consider educating Canadians on the merits of the plan, because it's actually one that's going to make life more affordable for them. At the same time, we do the right thing by our environment on an issue of existential importance.
For 80% of them. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Fraser.
That's pretty good in my mind. Yeah.
I appreciate your time today.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Sean Fraser, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment. Saskatchewan was just the first province to test the federal carbon tax in court. Ontario made its case during 4 days of hearings back in April. It's expected to be several months, though, before the judges rule in that case. In December, New Brunswick said it was launching its own legal challenge. Manitoba filed documents in federal court at the end of April, seeking a judicial review to kill the tax. And new Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has also vowed to challenge the federal plan in court. So what does today's ruling tell us about the fate of those other court challenges and what could happen when the decision is appealed? Joining me now is Errol Mendez, law professor at the University of Ottawa. Hi, Professor Mendez. Great to see you.
Great to see you too.
Let's start off with the majority decision, the 3 and the 3-2 decision.
Right.
Can you tell us in layman's terms what exactly they ruled?
Well, it's fascinating to see how they differed in their approach to the issue. The majority, for example, much of their first part of their ruling focuses on how we signed the Paris Accord. Then there was the federal-provincial negotiations, the so-called Vancouver Declaration, which then led to a framework to talk about how to establish the minimal benchmarks to achieve the $10 a ton, etc., which then they go into, so what does that mean in terms of where the federal government is saying there is a federal power of national concern within what's called the Peace, Order and Good Government Clause. And then they focus much more narrowly than what the federal government was arguing, but very focused on an approach that BC was arguing, which is, let's take that benchmark and let's see how there was an approach to this issue which, according to the jurisprudence which is necessary, it was a single, indivisible and distinct subject matter, and then they focused on this benchmark. They called it in very...
What do you mean by benchmark?
Well, it's interesting that they used a term which most people would not understand. They called it National Standards in Price Stringency for GHG emissions. Translate that into layman's purpose is that after they did the framework from Paris to the Vancouver Declaration, said, okay, what does it mean if we're aiming for a 10-ton benchmark, that each province could have to meet that minimal, if you like, standard target for that. And so they focused on that standard. They called it the national standards for price stringency for emissions.
And how does that differ from what the minority decided?
Well, the minority basically first put a lot of their ruling on the taxation aspect of it. First of all, they said, okay, this could be either a levy based on regulation, or it could be a straightforward tax. They came to the conclusion that this was a tax, and because it was basically something which was being imposed by governing council, not by Parliament, they decided that it was an illegal delegation of taxation, and that goes that old phrase, which is no taxation without representation. So on that basis, they said it was an unconstitutional tax. But then they went on to say, to deal with this larger issue of whether or not this issue has become of such national concern that there should be a federal power to regulate that benchmark, so to speak.
Right.
And they came to the conclusion, no, because it is not single and indivisible and distinct, because if you were to make it that way, to use some of the actual wording, it would rip the heart out of the division of powers and would, in effect, make the federal government the regulator of regulators. In other words, they would then try and
My brain's starting to hurt
exactly.
right now. Yeah.
But to put it in layperson's language, I'm hoping I can achieve.
Which I appreciate, yeah.
Is basically saying, essentially what the federal government is doing, if they claim that this is of national concern, you're basically going to say that we're going to regulate how you regulate everything in your province if it becomes an issue of national concern. In other words, you're by indirectly taking away some of our most important powers.
Will any of this have an impact on the other challenges that are proceeding right now?
Well, I think so, because the majority ruling seems to have actually taken the BC's government's argument based on this benchmark approach to make the national concern a narrower issue. And again, BC argued the same thing in the Ontario Court of Appeal. And from listening to the questions and the reaction of the judges, they seem to have more agreement with that than with some of the other arguments that the federal government was making. In fact, I personally think that BC made a much better argument in the Ontario Court of Appeal than the federal government. And so my prediction is there's going to be a similar result in the Ontario Court of Appeal. There will be a dissent, just seeing some of the questions that were coming from some of the judges. There will definitely be a dissent. But ultimately, these issues are so important, they're going to end up in the Supreme Court of Canada.
And is there any way to predict how that will play out, other than perhaps even what you might envision for a timeline?
Well, there could very well be a division there too, between a majority and minority. But here's the interesting issue. If any appeal is made to the Supreme Court of Canada, it'll probably be after the election. Well, what if there's a different government in power there who decides they don't want to do the carbon tax? Will the Supreme Court of Canada still go ahead with the hearing, or say it's what's called a moot issue? So there's some really fascinating issues involved in this. But to me, the most fascinating issue coming out of the ruling is the way in which the majority took a global perspective on this issue, whereas the minority took a very provincial, narrow approach to this whole issue, which in some respects represents the country.
It sure does. All right. Thank you very much, Professor Mendez. Appreciate the help in understanding this complicated decision. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Disappointed with today's ruling, but it is only one step in the battle against the Trudeau carbon tax. We will be closely reviewing today's ruling, and it will be appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. I note that today's ruling was a 3-2 split decision, with two judges providing a detailed dissenting opinion that the carbon tax is, in fact, unconstitutional. So there are strong grounds for an appeal. Other provinces are proceeding with their own court challenges. In Ontario, in New Brunswick, in Manitoba, and in all likelihood, Alberta. Saskatchewan plans to intervene in each of these cases. But ultimately, the fate of the Trudeau carbon tax will be decided in the federal election this fall.
Saskatchewan's court battle against the federal climate plan goes bust as the carbon tax is ruled constitutional. But Premier Scott Moe is vowing to fight on. Ontario, Manitoba, and New Brunswick have also taken legal action against the federal carbon tax. Will it be the ballot box question this fall? As Premier Moe believes. Time for the Power Panel. In Edmonton, Emma Graney of the Edmonton Journal. iPolitics' Marty Patriquin is in Montreal. And here with me in studio, Le Devoir's Marie Vestel and Marika Walsh, also of iPolitics. Hi, guys.
Hey.
Hey there. Friday. Emma, I'll start with you because obviously Alberta plans to, or Premier Jason Kenney has said he plans to launch a challenge as well. What do you think today's decision does to the momentum behind those challenges?
You know, honestly, here in Alberta, I think it just gets people even more galvanised. I mean, we just voted in Jason Kenney as Premier. Bill number 1 under the UCP government is going to be getting rid of the carbon tax. So here in Alberta, on the ground, it seems like this was just no one's going to disagree with the fact that the UCP government is going to continue to try and push this through the courts. But on the flip side, just as Premier Moe was saying, this is going to be a ballot question in the federal election. And again, here in Alberta, it's going to be pretty pre-decided anyway. I mean, we're a pretty conservative province, tend to vote that way historically in all of the in all of the federal elections, well, and provincial too, I guess, when you put it that way. So I think here in Alberta, people are probably a little bit disappointed, but Jason Kenney has said, you know what, we're just going to continue the fight anyway, and we're going to actually launch into this court battle now too. Even though we had intervener status, we're going to get stuck into it.
Marty, if this is a ballot box question in the federal election, how does this impact that discussion?
Very good question. And, you know, he mentioned that this is a one stage and a many-step issue. In fact, I get a many-step problem. So that's what Mr. Moe said. I count 2 steps. Saskatchewan lost, and it goes to Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules ultimately. So the political pressure is going to come from obviously this decision, but also the decisions in Ontario and Manitoba, probably Alberta eventually. Whether and if the courts there go in favor of this. The interesting thing now, of course, is that this decision now becomes precedent, so other courts can rely on it when making their own decision. And that also obviously that includes the Supreme Court when they're considering the merits of the case. You know, this is from the outset. This is a political move on the part of provincial leaders. They don't like Justin Trudeau. They don't like the carbon tax, so they're going after him that way. This has always been an uphill battle. The idea that, as Saskatchewan put forward, which is a patently absurd argument, that the federal government doesn't have the right to regulate or introduce taxes to things that they don't like, is absurd. But they're going to go through the motions, not for any reason other than the fact that they don't like Trudeau and they don't like the carbon tax.
Although the majority of the court interpreted it as a regulation and therefore said it was okay, whereas the minority, the dissenting minority,
saw
viewed
it
it
as
as
a
a
tax.
tax, and then that was
But to
one
that-
of the differences at least.
The one thing I would say to that is that this is one of the, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't aware of the full scope of Saskatchewan arguments at the time. And this one is where the Saskatchewan government actually said that the federal government doesn't have the rights to tax property and civil rights and other matters of purely local nature falling within the exclusive provincial legislative authority. That is the most silliest thing I've ever heard in my life. It's pretending the idea that greenhouse gas emissions are polite enough to observe the borders of Saskatchewan. Which is patently
They're saying
absurd.
their resources are.
they not?
That's the argument, though, right? And that's the argument, for example, Jason Kenney was making yesterday about Bill C-69. Our resources are solely within provincial jurisdiction. The government is saying, but the emissions from those
the fruits
have
of those
interprovincial impact.
exactly, and it's the same thing. Look, it's exactly the same thing as acid rain back in the 80s. You could argue the same
Sound like
thing.
Catherine McKenna? Yeah. Marie?
Do I really? Oh God!
Back to,
Okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm done.
I'm kidding.
just to go back to today's decision, I'm not sure that this decision necessarily, it could influence, but I'm not sure it dictates the decision that the Ontario Court of Appeal will take, that the federal court will take for Manitoba, and that whichever court Jason Kenney decides to address his case to decides. It'll also be interesting to see what the federal government claims in these cases, because I was talking to an intervener in the Ontario case who said that the federal government actually tweaked their argument in the Ontario case, which came after, to make it so the federal argument was even less intrusive, as some would say, into provincial jurisdiction. And so you could think if this one came through and the federal government won, even though their argument was more restrictive of provincial jurisdiction, if they make it even less restrictive, it could help the government argument down the road. That'll be something interesting to see. I think it's definitely a win for the federal Liberal government. It's not a knockout because there is a minority decision and it does give the provinces more grounds to go to the Supreme Court, but it is a win, and no matter the debate and the positions in the election campaign, which we can already guess and which we already know, they can say, well, the courts said we could do this, and so we do have the courts on our side, and this won't be settled by the Supreme Court before the next election.
Yeah, this is political strategy with the courts as the sideshow. The courts are the theater, they're the stage, but this is really about the political strategy that the Conservatives and the Liberals see. They both see this as a fight they can win. And so that's what, in part, what makes this so interesting, because we'll see in the fall which side does win, but both see this as something that they can win. And so because of that, we're seeing these really big and strong arguments from both sides.
Yeah, it's so interesting also, Emma, because I feel like they're making the argument that, for example, the outcome of provincial elections lately in Alberta, in Ontario, are indicative of sentiment that people are against the carbon tax.
No, not in Quebec.
But not in Quebec.
BC.
That's what I'm saying. But also, it's hard to determine. I mean, yes, they were central parts of the campaign, but do people vote? Are people going to vote in the federal election even on? Can
Only
you correlate things so directly, right?
And in Ontario, though, actually more people voted for parties that are for a carbon price. So Doug Ford won a majority government.
Then he won a majority, so.
But 40%, with 40% of the population. Everybody else voted for somebody who was putting forward, and that's what the Liberals federally are hooking their
And the
hands
other
on.
thing is, by the time the federal election comes, these Conservative governments will have started implementing policies, right? I don't think it'll change much in Alberta. I agree with Emma that people in Alberta don't want a carbon tax. They probably weren't going to vote for Trudeau. They're not going to vote any more or any less for Trudeau today. But in Ontario, where people are starting to see the effects of the Doug Ford government's cuts or the budget that has come down this spring, I wonder if, there is also a potential backlash there. And it's not uncommon to see a government of one color provincially and another federally. So I don't think it's a guarantee that because they voted for Ford, they would still want to vote for Mr. Scheer.
Emma, what do you think?
I think.
Sorry, I just want to get Emma.
Yeah, go
in,
ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, interestingly, when you're talking about the different policies, here in Alberta, the budget isn't coming until the fall. So that could very well come after the federal election. So when you're talking about the impact on the coffers, the provincial coffers here, we're not going to have a carbon tax anymore. So that is billions of dollars out of the provincial coffers. And the UCP hasn't said where the money is going to come from. You know, they're going to cut the corporate tax rate, so that's going to be less money for the province as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see whether they have the budget before or after the federal election. And because that way, if there are potential implications coming from getting rid of the carbon tax here in Alberta, Albertans may not even see that before they go to the ballot box.
Although the UCP is arguing that those cuts in corporate tax rates will spur development and
Lots
grow
of jobs,
the economy.
50,000 of them, absolutely.
There are studies that say that doesn't work, though.
Yeah, but I'm saying that's what they're arguing, to be fair. And Marty, sorry, you want to get in?
Destroys the decision sort of destroys a key talking point of or two key talking points of the people that are against a carbon tax. The first is that you know, people like fishermen and construction workers and farm workers will necessarily you know, be hurt by the carbon tax. In fact, it specifically says that fishermen and forestry workers and are exempt from this. So, you know, the idea that everybody is being, like the people, the heartland of this country is being hurt by the carbon tax is patently absurd. It just doesn't make any sense.
But it's resonating in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan,
I know, it's because
where there are people who pay a lot to, you know, develop resources whose livelihoods depend on them and who, you know, need a car to drive far distances.
Yeah, and
but
to
that to that point, you can go to what the parliamentary budget officer says,
Yes.
Which is nonpartisan. I'll remind everyone that says that everybody except for the top 20%, top 20% will actually see a return on this.
But he did say that in Saskatchewan, though the return would be much smaller.
Yeah, in Saskatchewan, and I know that's what he's saying. I think it's hard to argue. I mean, if you've lived out in rural Saskatchewan, you understand it's a very different way of life. And that argument that's being put forth, I can understand why it would resonate.
And that's what Emma, to Emma's point at the beginning of this, about how Albertans feel about the carbon tax, I think is really about that, right? It's, you know, facts at some point don't matter. If you feel alienated, you feel ignored, and you feel like your economic struggles aren't being recognized by the federal government, that is a problem for the federal government.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.